Dear friends, welcome to my channel. Today we will talk about how the Russian occupiers have carried out one of the most massive attacks on Ukraine, specifically targeting the Ukrainian capital. During the night, the enemy used 175, just think about that, UAVs against Kyiv alone, 14 cruise missiles, and at least 2 ballistic missiles. June 18 has been declared a day of mourning in Kyiv. At this moment, it is known that at least 15 people have died in Kyiv. The highest number of casualties occurred as a result of a Russian Kh-101 cruise missile hitting a multi-story residential building in the Solomiansky district. Trump demanded complete capitulation from Tehran, and Israel eliminated the new chief of the general staff of the Iranian armed forces 3 days after his appointment. Trump abruptly cut short his participation in the G7 summit in Canada and flew to Washington, which drew criticism from the media. It also became known that the White House disbanded the special commission responsible for developing a sanctions strategy against Russia. This decision was made just 3 months after the commission was established, and Trump postponed the introduction of all new sanctions against the Russian Federation. Friends, we'll cover all this and more in our review. So today the enemy once again unleashed drones and cruise ballistic missiles on peaceful Ukrainian cities. These are not military targets at all, but as Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov cynically stated, he called strikes on schools and hospitals, just think about it, quasi-military targets. So these so-called quasi-military targets today were mostly apartment buildings where Kyiv residents, people from Odessa and other Ukrainian cities were peacefully sleeping. Today the enemy concentrated most of its strikes on Kyiv, Odessa, as well as the Kyiv and Chernihiv regions. In Kyiv, impacts were recorded in 27 locations. 15 people were killed, and as of now, it is known that there are 139 wounded throughout the city. The enemy used 175 drones, 14 cruise missiles, and at least 2 ballistic missiles. The most tragic incident occurred in the Solomiansky district of the capital. Here, a Coach 101 cruise missile destroyed the entrance of a 9-story panel apartment building. Beneath the rubble were the bodies of Kyiv residents. City officials arrived at the scene. Mayor Vitaly Klitschko, leaders of the Kyiv military administration, in particular Timur Tachenko, Interior Minister Klimenko, and rescue workers, and in the video filmed by Radio Liberty journalists, it is clearly visible that while rescue operations were underway, Russia continued its drone attacks on the Ukrainian capital. In particular, one of the drones struck not far from the site of the collapsed entrance in Solomiansky. Overall, the highest number of strikes were recorded in the Sviatoshinsky, Solomiansky, Darnitsky, Dniprovsky, Podilsky, and Obolonsky districts of the Ukrainian capital. There are also reports of damage in open areas in the Obolonsky and Podilsky districts, and in Dniprovsky, a drone fragment became lodged in the wall of a residential building. Today, Mayor Klitschko also displayed cluster munitions that were used by the enemy to inflict maximum harm on civilians. In other words, this is yet another use of banned weapons in strikes against civilian targets. Cluster munitions were used today, as reported by the media today. As a result, people were killed in open areas on the left bank. There were also reports of these cluster munitions falling in the Sviatoshinsky district of the capital. In Odessa, as a result of a Russian missile attack, fires and blazes also broke out. It has been reported that 1 person was killed and 17 were injured, including minors. Residential buildings in the center of Odessa were also damaged. There may be people trapped under the rubble. Rescue operations are ongoing, according to Oleg Kiper, head of the regional military administration. Overall, the Russian army has sharply increased its use of drones to attack peaceful Ukrainian cities. According to journalists' calculations, in the first 2 weeks, Moscow attacked Kyiv, Odessa, Kharkiv, and other cities more than it did in several months last year. This is reported by the leading American publication, the Wall Street Journal. At the same time, raids involving 300 or even 400 drones in a single night have in fact become a routine occurrence. Analysts from the British Centre for Information Resilience, CIR, have determined that since the beginning of 2023, Russia has launched a total of 34,454 strike and decoy drones against Ukraine. And of those, nearly 2,500 were launched just this year. In other words, in just 6 months of this year, they have launched more than in all of the previous 3 years since the invasion began. It is also reported that the highest number of aerial strike assets was used on the night of June 9th, 499. Of these, 479 were drones and 20 were missiles. In total, in March, Ukrainian air defense forces shot down 2,431 drones out of 4,002 launched. According to the statistics, that's about 58%. And in May, 1,887 out of 4,002 was shot down. That's 47%. Russia ramped up production since the Iranian Shahed turned out to be a perfect fit for the needs of the Russian army. A total of $1,750 million was paid for this Iranian technology. This also included the equipment, source code, and the purchase of the first 600 drones from Iran. Thus, Iran became a full accomplice in Russia's military aggression against Ukraine. He didn't just support Russia, he completely transferred the technology for producing the Shahed to them. And at this point, Russia plans to increase production from the current figure of 100, or according to some sources, 200 per day up to 500 drones per day. At the same time, the ratio between decoys, so-called mock-up products, and strike drones is approximately 50-50. Such airstrikes are carried out against Ukrainian cities in a concentrated manner, targeting 2 or 3 cities from several directions. And the drones are launched not only from ships and aircraft, attacking in waves and creating a swarm effect, which complicates and overloads the air defense system. It is absolutely clear that the technology for using these drones perfected by the Russian occupation army will also be used by Iran, of course, unless Tehran's war machine is broken. More on this later. So, US President Donald Trump, who abruptly cut short his participation in the G7 summit held in Canada, announced that he is demanding the complete capitulation of Tehran. At the same time, Trump stated that Iran would have to completely abandon its uranium enrichment program in order to put an end to new attacks from Israel. Israel, meanwhile, announced the day before that it does not intend to stop its attacks. And the Wall Street Journal reported that the authorities in Tehran are already sending signals through several Arab countries about their readiness to immediately begin negotiations. If a ceasefire is established, they are prepared to abandon their own nuclear weapons program, but not from the nuclear program as a whole. That is, Iran does not intend to give up using nuclear technology for civilian purposes. Trump, speaking to journalists aboard the presidential plane Air Force One before returning to Washington from Canada, stated that Iran cannot have nuclear weapons. It's very simple. Trump also had a falling out with yet another one of his loyal supporters. Tell me, who hasn't he argued with yet? Let's recall Trump's first term. He practically parted ways with all the members of his team, including Vice President Pence. And now, after Musk, it's Tucker Carlson's turn on of Trump's most devoted fans and supporters. Trump called him crazy in his tweet, writing, "Explain to this crazy Tucker that Iran cannot have its own nuclear weapons." This was his response to criticism from Carlson, who in particular stated that the United States should not be drawn into a war against Iran, as this could lead to the start of World War III. But Trump appreciated these efforts by Tucker Carlson, calling him, I repeat, crazy. At the same time, as Trump himself stated, Israel informed him that it does not intend to reduce the intensity of its attacks on Iran and plans to increase them as much as possible over the next couple of days. At the same time, he himself said that he wants a real end to this war, not just a ceasefire. He plans to bring in the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin, who, during a phone conversation with Trump on his birthday, offered his mediation services. But getting ahead of ourselves, let's say that Israel has already officially rejected Putin's offer. This was announced by Press Secretary Dmitry Peskov. Israel refused to accept Russia's mediation. At the moment, we see an unwillingness, at least on the part of Israel, to turn to any mediation services or to pursue a peaceful settlement at all. That is what we are observing. Those are Peskov's words. He also noted that the situation in the Middle East is escalating rapidly and is completely unpredictable. Netanyahu himself, at the start of the operation against Iran, stated that Israel had given 60 days, essentially an ultimatum to the Iranian leadership to conduct negotiations on the nuclear deal with the United States. And on the 61st day, when it became clear that Iran, following Moscow's example, was simply dragging out the negotiations, in other words, just as Putin is not planning to make an agreement with Ukraine, Iran was also not intending to make any nuclear deal with Trump. And that is why Israel is waging, as Netanyahu stated, a war for survival, an existential war. And we will achieve our goal and inflict devastating damage on them. A blow. By the way, there are indeed some new successes for the IDF here. The Israel Defense Forces have eliminated her, at least. That's what they claim. And the Iranian authorities have not denied it. The new chief of the general staff of the Iranian Armed Forces, Ali Shodmani. This was reported by the IDF press service. According to the press service of the Israel Defense Forces, Shodmani was one of the closest people to Iran's leader Khamenei. Iran, I repeat once again, has not commented on this situation. Shodmani was appointed to this position only 3 days ago, after the previous chief of the general staff of the Iranian armed forces, Mohammad Bagheri, was eliminated as a result of an Israeli attack on June 13. Well, as we can see, he didn't get to command the Iranian armed forces for very long. And this is a clear signal that anyone appointed to this position is essentially signing their own death warrant. And what about Donald Trump? The reason for his unexpected departure from the G7 summit, which was held in Canada. It is reported that the American leader was planning to leave Canada after the official dinner, but in the end, he didn't even stay for that. At the same time, he stated that his top priority was discussing the Iran issue, and only after that, Ukraine. He also made it clear to the G7 summit participants that he would have liked to stay to discuss and hold talks on these two issues, but he had to urgently return to Washington to deal with the situation in the Middle East. Also, as he was leaving, Trump, true to form, immediately lashed out at French President Emmanuel Macron in a tweet, accusing him of self-promotion. He said basically that Macron was making statements about his departure, but that Macron had no idea why he was actually flying back to Washington. But in the end, he never actually explained the reasons behind his own decision. Because of this, the scheduled meeting between Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky, who had flown to Canada specifically to meet with the American leader, also had to be cancelled. However, as the Wall Street Journal reports, the meeting with Zelensky was cancelled without any explanation or rescheduling. At the same time, in an official statement from the White House, Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt announced that Trump had decided to leave the G7 summit early and return to Washington due to developments in the Middle East. So how will this end? What was the urgency here, considering that Iran wants these consultations and is seeking peaceful negotiations, while Israel does not? In other words, what was the need for an urgent return? Given that Putin's mediation services were officially rejected by Jerusalem, what will happen next remains a big question. Well, for Putin at least, his game with Trump here did not lead to the desired outcome. But on the other hand, there is other positive news for the Kremlin. In particular, it is reported that Trump has decided to postpone sanctions against the Kremlin as he is officially waiting for the conclusion of an agreement to resolve the war in Ukraine. This was reported by the media today. Trump officially announced that he is delaying the introduction of new sanctions against Russia, expecting that an agreement will be signed between Kyiv and Moscow. He stated this himself to journalists during the G7 summit in Canada. I'm waiting to see if an agreement will be signed. It also became known today that while Trump is deliberating, the United Kingdom has introduced the next package of sanctions against Russia. And Trump responded, Europe talks about it, but hasn't done anything yet. We'll see if they do. And don't forget, sanctions cost us a lot of money. That's billions and billions of dollars. It's not a one-way street. By the way, it's telling that today, aboard his presidential plane Air Force One, journalists asked Trump what he thinks and how he would comment on today's barbaric attack on Kyiv. Trump asked in return, what happened there? When was that? They replied, it literally just happened. To which he replied, I need to see what happened there. I'll take a look and then obviously I'll formulate my position. But all we can do is hope that perhaps the reason for this is that Trump's advisors and his intelligence services are keeping him completely in the dark about everything happening in Ukraine, which is very, very strange, considering that intelligence briefings are always absolutely detailed and often in just one or two sentences provide the most important information, so to speak, for your eyes only worthy of the president's attention. And naturally, we can assume that in this daily briefing, which the president receives at least twice a day, in the morning and in the evening, and if there is an emergency, it could be 3 or 4 times a day. So we can only assume that for some unknown reason, the American intelligence services did not include information about the record-breaking missile and drone attack on Ukraine, particularly Kyiv. Was that even possible? Well, as they say, who knows? Although I'll say it again, it's very, very hard to believe. And one more, of course, positive piece of news for Putin, the Trump administration disbanded the interagency working group that was responsible for developing sanctions against Russia. She acted and coordinated with senior US National Security Council officials. According to Reuters, this was a response to Putin's refusal to cease fire in Ukraine, as well as Trump's increasingly tough rhetoric towards Vladimir Putin himself. The initiative itself lasted only about 3 months before it was quietly buried. However, as American media believe, not everything has been finally decided yet. Trump still may take a tougher stance towards Putin, as he is under pressure from his allies, in particular the well-known Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, whom Trump has asked not to bring his bill to a vote in the Senate for now. This bill, prepared together with Richard Blumenthal, has already been supported by 82 senators and concerns tightening sanctions, the so-called hellish sanctions package, which includes a 500% tariff on goods from countries that purchase oil and gas from Russia. Well, Trump may, as sources say, toughen his stance towards Putin. He is disappointed, or maybe he can't. In short, when it comes to Trump, nothing is clear here. A person who today considers you a friend, a best buddy like Musk or Tucker Carlson, he takes pictures with them in the White House garden, hugs them, calls them his best friends, and then the next day they're already crazy or have lost their minds, as he said about Elon Musk. Well, those are the news we have for today.